Welcome to the Consummate Athlete Podcast, where we explore what it means to be a well-rounded, happy, goal-crushing athlete. Every week, myself, sports journalist Molly Herford, and cycling coach and kinesiologist Peter Glassford interview experts and chat through all of your training questions. We're excited to have you along for the ride. Hello. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete Podcast. Peter, how's it going?
It's going really well. We're into the race season here. The summer is coming. We're struggling to include strength training in our endurance training routines.
Which is fair, because definitely as the weather gets better, we're off the trainer, we're outside. And frankly, when the weather is nice, I kind of understand the impetus to want to spend as much time outdoors as possible versus doing your strength training inside. All that to say, are we putting a squat rack on the deck?
So we've been looking at doing this, or some sort of trap bar, but before we make any big decisions and purchases, we were lucky to have Dan Cleather back on the podcast, who's one of my favorite writers, I would say, strength coaches, talking about just training principles. So we've had him on talking about his little black book of training wisdom, which I would say is in the top 3. Sometimes it might even be the top book on training that I recommend to people. So Dan has a new series of books, and then this latest one, so this is his 4th series, is called Strength Training for Endurance Performance. This is Force 3, book Force, the 3rd book in the 4th series. And so it looks at, indeed, how we might and what it looks like to train for strength for endurance performance.
Yes, and while the Force series might sound like it's going to be actually, I don't know, maybe kind of Star Wars nerdy or science nerdy, you guys do actually get into some practical stuff in this episode. It's not just the science behind strength training, it's also how to actually implement it into the life of a busy endurance athlete.
Right, there's that. I mean, definitely these are all, in some ways coaching books, but lots of people read the Joe Friel books. A lot of athletes want to know how to train, and so you do end up in this more sciencey side of things. But Dan's gift as a strength coach, as an educator, is that he makes these complex topics more accessible and easy to understand. That's why I like the first book I read, his little black book, is because it does take sort of like training theory globally, easy days, hard days. It applies to whether you're strength training or a sprinter or whatever, and applies these into sort of good takeaways. The idea of consistency is a big theme in that book as well. So with the Force series, it's about biomechanics. The first 2 especially are about force, like applying force. But then this 3rd one is sort of paints this argument that as endurance athletes, there's sort of this physiological or metabolic reasons. We're so focused on VO2 max and carbs and energy, but then we forget about the biomechanical or the force side of things. And so his contention is that to express force, we need to be able to do that. And the best way to train the ability to express force is through strength training. So he talks about that and sort of paints this argument. And so it's really a bit of a paradigm shift, even for me as someone who loves strength and is a kinesiology student and practitioner. It's to look at endurance performance as how hard can you push down, basically, or how fast can you jump, versus the actual access to the energy as sort of part of this equation. There's sort of those 2 sides to the equation.
So are we getting a squat rack on the back deck?
Yeah. And so that might sound a little complicated, but then we do get into how long does the session need to be, a little, depending on the time of year, obviously, and then where we fit that. And the book itself goes into sort of the common, I get sore when I do strength training, I don't want to give up time, that sort of thing. So we sort of talk a little around the sort of the common protest about strength training, the reasons endurance athletes just don't do it.
But are we getting a squat rack on the deck?
We'll see. Yeah, you're more excited now than when I proposed this last week, so we'll see.
Like I say, I feel like I waffle on this, but actually I've been thinking maybe I could also use it as my paddleboard rack or something. So my brain is more on board with it.
Okay.
Also, just to annoy our condo board, frankly.
That's right. Yeah.
Apologies.
You got to push the limits at all times. Yeah. So we'll get right into this. And I would say the only other really interesting thing that we get into is that Dan's been sort of doing studies with NASA and, sort of going into space stuff and how we train astronauts with zero gravity, which is, I sort of said was almost interesting because a lot of us as cyclists, as swimmers without the weight bearing, I do wonder how much will come back as far as interventions that are really effective at maintaining muscle mass, because astronauts, I guess, spend a lot of time trying to maintain muscle mass when they're in space. So that was sort of an interesting thing that's also happening in Dan's life that we were able to chat about on the podcast as well.
All right, love it. And don't forget to check out his book, Strength Training for Endurance Performance. And on the note of books, Shred Girls Book 4, Lindsay and the Curse of Gemini Lakes, is out on May 27th.
Sounds like a great pairing.
Great pairing. Perfect for anyone.
You have your fiction, and then you have the nonfiction. And yeah, there's some sort of polarization there. That's probably great training theory for your reading.
Something in it for everybody. So definitely head over to the show notes to grab links to both of those. All right, let's get into this conversation with Dan Cleather.
Very excited. We're back today with Dan Cleather. Dan, thank you for being on the podcast again.
Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, no, we're having you back. It's been years. I think you've had three books. Yeah, three books since we last spoke. We spoke about your little black book of training wisdom, which I still think is the best book. I recommend it to people. They say, what should I get to learn about training? I don't even care about the sport you're in. It is the best book. So I will put that back out there. We will link to Little Black Book of Training. But you have written three books in your Force series. And the last one especially caught my eye because it's called Strength Training for Endurance Performance, Force Book 3. And it was a great read again. So I'm so psyched to talk about this today. And I know in the world of endurance training, strength training, has been proven to be effective for a long time. We've had a little bit of a bump up in the last couple of years because of I guess menopause, for lack of a more concise way to put it. The menopause research has pushed a lot of athletes that we work with to look into strength training and this lifting heavy shit, as they call it. So there's been a little bit of an uptick, but I'll be honest that it's still not quite there. And I think your book paints some of the reasons that I think get missed. That we'll get into today, why strength training is important for endurance athletes. So that's what we'll talk today about. But I thought to start, I like to dig in on what people have been up to and their Instagrams and so forth. And I have noticed that you've been weightless and up in planes and using force plates for all sorts of things. So maybe just give us a little, the world of Dan Cleather. What have you been up to in the last little bit here and going into space? Question mark?
Yeah, I don't know how I got so lucky to be involved in the things I've been involved in for the last 5 years. I never had a sort of burning career aspiration to be involved in doing research for space. But a very clever man called John Kennett came to me 5 years ago. He said, I've developed this exercise device for astronauts. Do you want to help me test it? And I was like, okay, sounds interesting. And then we've been on a bit of a roller coaster because essentially this machine that John has developed is designed to allow astronauts to jump when they're weightless. Astronauts have to, so to go back a little bit, astronauts need to do lots of exercise to stop themselves kind of losing physical condition. And they lose physical condition really, really quickly because they're not loaded in microgravity. So kind of your musculoskeletal system is used to experiencing lots and lots of forces. That disappears and you start losing it straight away. Astronauts currently spend a really surprising amount of time every day. They quote something like 25% of the working day on the International Space Station is spent on exercise. Wow. Just to stay healthy. But even despite the amount of exercise they do, they still come back deconditioned. And then the other problem is that the stuff that's on the ISS, the International Space Station, is really big and bulky and couldn't be employed in, say, a mission to Mars. So that's where the device that we're developing comes in. Jumping, we think, is going to be a more effective countermeasure. And also this device is really, really well engineered and is tiny relative to what's on ISS. As part of that and kind of the most funky things that we've done is we've actually been to Bordeaux in France on two separate occasions to test this device in parabolic flight. And parabolic flight recreates microgravity in a terrestrial environment, and it does so by having the plane fly parabolas.
Right.
And so that sounds horrific to some degree, and some people get very sick.
Right.
So it's called the vomit comet sometimes.
Okay. Okay.
Um, but yeah, like each time it goes over the top of one of these parabolas, you get about 22 seconds of microgravity
Okay.
to test the device.
And then are
Um,
you, I guess, you're in the top of this, you're weightless for 22 seconds. Do you have to then throw down a bunch of jump squats or something? Like, what is the exercise you do in 22 seconds? Like, how are you doing that?
yeah, so like in each 22 seconds, we've got this device on the plane, so the kind of the subject's strapped into this device. And in each 22 second, it's like, okay, we're in microgravity, go. And they do a set of the exercise.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, we've done two campaigns, each of which consists of three flights. We've actually spent kind of in total about 70 minutes in microgravity. Um, which is more than Katy Perry's 4 minutes.
Right.
Not that I'm sure she could spend 70 minutes in parabolic flight if she chose to, but yeah, we're going back to Bordeaux in a week and a half to do another campaign. So things in the life of me, things are crazy busy at the moment because of it's a very extreme research environment actually. So kind of the preparation that goes into these types of campaigns is large.
Wow. Well, there you go. Yeah, like you say, you never would have thought, strength coach in St. Mary's University is now going up and trying to exercise in weightlessness. Yeah, this is impressive.
No, I don't know. I don't know how I got so lucky, but they're it's a lot of work, but they're amazing experiences.
Hmm. Well, maybe if I can try and transition that to endurance sport, certainly in the cycling world, there's a bit of issue around maintaining bone and muscle mass because we are not weightless. I guess that's not how we do, but we're not loading, we're sort of suspended as we pedal along. So there's some of these concerns, I guess, are relevant. One of the things in the book that sort of seems central was just this idea that force expression, which maybe you can tell us a bit about that, is critical to endurance performance. And it's I guess what you're saying is that like strength is important, but is it as simple as saying that? Like, why is that? You say it's a counterintuitive. So maybe tell us a bit. Like, force expression is critical to endurance performance. Let's start there, and we'll see where we get.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think it's counterintuitive because if you start talking about force expression, people immediately think of a bodybuilder or a weightlifter. So kind of like if you say strength training, people think, of people in the gym. Like, so that's kind of the image that saying anything like that conjures in someone's mind. Um, Whereas kind of, and that leads us to overlook the fact that, well, whenever you move, whenever you or whenever you change your movement strictly, like you have to express force. And so kind of if you're cycling, you're expressing force the whole time. If you're, if you're running, you're expressing force. If you're rowing, you're expressing force. Um, and if you want to go faster, you need to express more force. Um, you know, and the more force, we can get to a discussion of how that's quantified, because from a perspective of endurance performance, like how do you add up how much force there is? Well, we would do that by calculating this quantity called work. Um, and the more work you do per unit time, the faster you will go. Um, but all of that comes back to force production. Like if you want to cover a set distance faster, you need to express more force per unit time as expressed in work done and power output.
Right.
Um, yeah, so kind of yeah, the endurance is about force expression. Um, I think where endurance athletes and coaches don't see that is they always make the assumption that, well, I've got a cardiovascular, my force expression capabilities are good enough that as long as I have the cardiovascular energy to power this force production system, then I'll be able to keep increasing my force production in line, with my ability to access energy. Um, and what I'm trying to do in the book is to challenge that
Right.
assumption that okay, there's no, or I challenge several assumptions, but that's one of the important.
Right. And you almost say there's the ability to access energy, which is like I guess you could say metabolism. Would that be VO2 max would be a way that we often talk about accessing energy?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Versus expressing the force. And so I guess from my own experience, I would say that I would be very cardiovascularly fit, but then I do find like sometimes we'll talk about like a muscular limitation where like you can't keep pushing that hard or it feels muscular. Is that sort of getting at this idea of expressing force that like where would we see that, I guess, right? Like where like do you know what I'm saying? Like what would be ways that we would be able to know that we're not expressing force as well as we could, or that's the limiter?
Well, I mean, the if you're talking about cycling, yeah, it, like you could take a bodybuilder, so or a strongman. So let's take Eddie Hall, if you know who Eddie Hall is, the
Sure.
British world's strongest man. I take him just because he likes to go and do challenges, and he
Yeah.
did a 250-meter rowing ergometer, and
Okay.
was really really good at it, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Like if you stick him on a bike, not a outdoor bike because that requires some skill in terms of how to ride the bike. But if you stick on him on a concept two ergometer and say go, he's going to beat almost all cycling athletes to a certain point, and
Right.
that point is, where he's fucked, like where he's not able to access energy anymore. Um, so that's one extreme. I think endurance athletes often tend to be on the other end of the extreme. It's like, well, I've got energy to go for days, but you can't go any faster. Like I mean, a really good example of that is Paula Radcliffe. If you think about Paula Radcliffe, who was the world record holder in the marathon, um, for women, but at shorter distances, like 5 or 10K, or the fact that she was world record holder at the marathon is indicative of a very, very high level of cardiovascular development.
Right.
But she couldn't bring that into the shorter distances because she couldn't go fast enough to use that engine. Like
Right.
she just wasn't quick enough, so she wasn't able to express over those shorter differences the level of force that matched her cardiovascular performance.
Right.
Does that make
Right.
sense?
It
I feel
does, yeah,
like I'm going
and
around
I
in
know
circles,
in the
but
marathon they talk about because you said she tried to go shorter, but they do talk a lot about when they're trying to break 2 hours for the men's marathon. It's like always like who is this 5K or 10K runner uh, in their youth, usually like when they're younger, and then they would like try and extend it out, and that's the person they're looking for. Like, can they run this fast? And again, taking from my own example, like I would say that you talk in the book about a power curve, which I think most of the cyclists would be
yeah,
familiar with that. But the runners, it would be exactly what you're describing, like marathon, 10K, 5K. If you pictured that as a curve, the times that people are doing or the power in the cycling, it would be a flat curve, right? Where you're saying maybe Paula Radcliffe, we're sort of picking on her here a little bit, but her marathon pace or time isn't much different than the 10 or 5K, right? It doesn't increase in the way that the speed doesn't increase in the way that you would expect.
I mean, the power curve would absolutely be, the way to look at it. I mean, the more contemporary example would be Jakob Ingebrigtsen, who was, the favorite for the 1500 meters at the Olympics,
Mm,
is clearly fitter than everyone else, but over but he didn't win. He came fourth in the 1500 meters at the last Olympics. He just he wasn't able to go fast enough to get rid of these other people who didn't have a higher level of cardiovascular conditioning. Like in running, I think it's a bit it's that kind of being quick in running, like this it's very complex in kind of what makes you fast. Whereas I think in a sport like sort of and it's harder to do a power output curve. So in a sport like cycling or rowing, where you can just
We
get on
have
an
the power
odometer and
curve.
say,
Like I
yeah,
have them right
yeah,
here. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, no, but then it's much clearer to be able to see that, and it's kind of like, well, it's easier to evaluate where someone's strong or weak,
Mhm.
um, and and equally, I think it's probably I would have thought it's a little bit easier to also improve if you're weak in the shorter distances, because like it seems to me like this raw quality of just getting a bit more of an engine in terms of the strength capabilities will quite quickly translate
Right.
into more power output on the bike. Whereas simply getting a bit stronger in your legs isn't going to make you directly straight away be able to sprint faster. Like
Mm,
there's more going on there. I
yeah.
don't mean that to sort of belittle the technical aspects of cycling as a sport. Far from it.
Well, and perhaps they're in outdoor cycling, I specialize more in the off-road stuff, but the Tour de France climbing and sprinting, right? There's a bit of a dynamic, the bike moves side to side, but I think you make the argument that there's these, I would call them critical moments. I don't think that's what you said, but there's like moments in the race where we're riding or we're running or we're rowing, and then there's a sprint, an attack, a hard hill. And those are the moments that you're speaking to where everyone's got the endurance, they've all done the miles, but then there's a critical moment, and that's what's determining a lot of these events. And I think that's
I,
that's the central thing, right? Is like the race is
and
there.
like it's interesting. Like I used to work with Britain's best 1500-meter runner at the time, like a guy called Andy Badley. He made the Olympic final and the World Championships final in the 1500 meters. And it's really interesting talking to him about the differences of a championship race, which I don't think that you can't. I don't think you can really appreciate watching it or even see it looking at the split times, because these are races which people say are slow, but that they change. Talking to Andy, there's so many surges and pull back and surge and pull back. That although the time is slow, there's these constant changes in pace, and that's what people are doing there is because it's a short distance. Like it's really hard for the people with the big cardiovascular engines to get rid of the people who are better expressing force, who can sprint.
You're
They
describing my
just don't.
racing career right here.
So sorry. Uh, but yeah, so the only way that they can try and do that over those short distances is by having big accelerations drop back, big accelerations stop back. That's how they challenge, the cardiovascular engine, and or take the kick out of
Right.
people's legs. Yeah.
So now the contention though here then is, so we're sort of like, okay, I could see someone being like, well, they're just talking about anaerobic sprints, so I'm going to keep riding my bike and just do a lot of 10-second or 30-second or 60-second efforts. But your contention then is that one of the key factors, or the key factor, is force expression or development, and that strength training is the way to do that. So maybe walk us a bit through that, because that's, I think, the biggest hurdle we have today, is to overcome why I shouldn't just ride my bike 6 days a week, and maybe there's an argument to do more strength training.
And like I think that I wouldn't blame endurance coaches and athletes for that attitude, because I don't think that. I mean, I'm talking as a strength coach. Like, I don't think the strength coach community has been very good in selling our message, because we're often like, oh, like you hear a lot kind of, oh, you have to get in the gym, and you know, and no kind of sensitivity to the fact that what will make you better at riding your bike is riding your bike.
Right. Right.
Like, that's first and foremost. So like, if you want to get better at doing 10-second sprints in cycling, you have to do 10-second sprints in cycling. Absolutely certain of that. Like that
Mm-hmm.
is a core component of training for that.
Now, no one listening is
However,
doing the sprints, and in mountain biking the starts are very important, and they're 10, 30-second, 60-second efforts. So no one's doing those. So that's good advice to take away there.
okay,
But you're also saying strength training. Carry on, sorry.
yeah, no, but there's a ceiling. Like there's diminishing returns on any training.
Mm-hmm.
On any training regime. So kind of like if you're only on your bike twice a week and you want to be good at sprinting, sprint on your bike. Like,
Right.
um, but if you're on your bike 4 hours a day and you're already doing sprint training, then doing a little bit more sprint training is not going to have a huge amount of benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And
Or
equally, if you've
certainly
been
just,
training
or
on,
I was going to say even just
okay,
more, because the tendency would be to be, and I'll add, I'll do more riding, more running
yeah,
at long, slow distance, slow paces is what usually we do.
yeah, that would be my perception too. Absolutely. Um, Equally, um, the same concept of diminishing returns also applies if we're talking about athletes who have a very long training experience in that sport. So kind of, if you've been riding a bike for 20 years, at what point, adding your fourth, sprint, I know cyclists wouldn't do this, but like adding your fourth sprint session a week, like what's going to be the effect of that? Um, for me, like I was always a jump athlete. I played volleyball and basketball. Like, I could jump well, but kind of about the age of 18, I tapped out all of the improvements in jump performance that I was going to get through playing basketball and volleyball.
Mhm.
When I wanted to move to the next level, and to be able to jump higher, that's where this, having a novel stimulus of, and actually not training the sport, but just training to get strong then would translate into performances in my sport.
Mm.
So kind of if I'm talking about cycling, then it's kind of like, well, yeah, like it's you need to ride your bike. But if you've got 10 cycling sessions a week already in your program, my contention is that adding one strength training session is going to have a bigger bang for your buck than adding your 11th cycling session.
Right. Right. Okay. I think that's a good argument. Do you think about the words like capacity and skill? Like, how do you think about words like that when you're thinking about strength training and then an athlete doing an endurance sport? Is there a terminology there? Like, how do you think about those words, or would you add other words in there?
Well, yeah, I mean, the skill and capacity argument. I think we talked about, when I was last on this podcast, and it's a key thing in the Black Book. When we're talking about force expression, like there really is, you know, your ability to express force is both a skill and a capacity. And like an intuitive way to understand that is okay. Well, if you have bigger muscles, you've got more capacity. However, there's people with very small muscles who are able to exert high amounts of force because they're very skillful at using what they have. And if you translate that to sort of an endurance performance perspective, like we could, you want to be an effective endurance athlete, you want to be really, really good at expressing force in your competitive environment. So you need to be very, very skillful in expressing force effectively in a way that locomotes you as fast as you can. So if we go back to the rowing, not the rowing, the running argument,
Hmm.
like, you know, you can get people, bodybuilders are not great runners, even though they have a high capacity for expressing force in the weight room. Like that's why it's not cut and dried that if you get stronger, you'll be faster, because there's a skill of being able to exert force on the ground when you're running in a way that's effective and allows you to be fast. So that's being able to express high forces in a short amount of time, while still maintaining your rhythm and posture to be able to go fast. I think, in cycling, and I really, cycling's not a sport that I've ever worked with, so I don't know very much about it, but kind of, that there is, I understand a lot of technique to how you move the crank. Like, so, your ability to synchronize pushing and pulling at the same time,
Mm.
to be able to flex, to be able to extend the ankle, optimally, in rhythm, etc., etc. Like, these are all places where, there's the opportunity to be more skillful and be able to lay more force down and probably be able to have that bonus in force without having a huge metabolic cost associated with it. Like, if you're coordinating well in how you're pulling and pushing on the crank, and you're not fighting against yourself,
Right.
that's an example of how you can be efficient in moving the bike. Like, someone who's not able to do that efficiently, like, just if they're slightly off in their timing, well, they're going to be fighting. One foot's trying to do one thing while the other's doing the other. You're still doing work there, but it's work that's not making the bike go faster.
Right. Right. And now in the book, you talk a lot about productive power output. So is that sort of hunting in that direction that someone could put work out, do uh put effort out even, and then not, it might not be translating? Like, how do you think about that? And that can be in a rowing or running example, but productive power output, how is that different than what we might think of as power?
Yeah. Like, so, it's really important, and kind of, I always get my friend and colleague John Goodwin to review the things I write, and I kind of essentially, having taken his comments, I had to go through the book again and add productive in front of power output wherever it was relevant, because it's a critical, it's a critical concept here, which is, when you're moving, you're doing work all the time, but like, it's not necessarily that work is actually moving you somewhere. So kind of, in the book I talk about, if someone who's is not very good at swimming, they're going to they might do a lot of work just trying
Right.
to stay afloat,
Yeah.
and so they can be, so that's work done staying afloat. So they could be working really hard, but they're not going anywhere. Like, they can be
Mhm.
getting out of breath, and they're not going anywhere. Whereas, someone who's skillful, um, wants to be, you know, more of a greater proportion of their work they do actually directly locomotes them. And just as an aside, kind of, the strength coach Dan John, like, his sort of recommendation for how to fitness train effectively, lose weight effectively, is to find a way of locomoting that's very inefficient.
Right.
So
Yes.
get a 70-year-old bike that barely goes. You'll have to work really, really hard,
Right.
to make that go anywhere. Like, it's probably safer because you won't be going as fast. But that's the point. It's like, if your goal is simply to spend calories,
Right. Yeah. Why
well,
do you have like
like,
aerodynamic helmets and all the fanciest gear? Yeah.
exactly. Whereas the flip is true if you're competing. Yeah, like, if you're competing, what's important is that, yeah, as much of the work you do as possible is moving you there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I wonder, before we get too long in here, what maybe we talk a little bit like nuts and bolts of strength training, because I think that would be the next logical question is, okay, I've heard the lift heavy shit. I've heard what Dan's saying here. I get it. I see there's metabolic. I see there's force expression. So he says strength training is the best way to do it. I'm in. I get it. But then I think for cyclists, certainly there's sort of this like, well, what do you do when you get there? And you do propose sort of, there's a couple little programs in the book, but what would you say is like, what is a session for an endurance athlete? And I know that's a very broad question, but does it have to be squats? Is it long? Like, what are some like rough guidelines, I guess, when we're talking about the actual strength training session for an endurance athlete?
So I'll probably duck the specifics of the question a little bit. Sorry, mainly because like, I'm very naive about cycling training. But I will talk to kind of, I think, the main mistake that, endurance athletes make when they decide they're going to strength train, because most, I think, endure, or it's very, very common when endurance athletes are convinced that they're going to strength train, that they want to train in a way that transfers to sports performance, of course. And so they do so by trying to replicate the sport in the weight room.
Right.
But because they're coming from this cardiovascular emphasis type, point of view, that they just end up doing more cardiovascular
Right.
training in the weight room.
Right. So you're saying I would do a circuit and I would do step ups because it looks like a biking, and I'd maybe hunch over when I do my step up, so that I look like I'm in a biking
Exactly.
position. Maybe I'd hold a handlebar while I do this or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All
No
good.
weight, no
All
weights
exactly.
though. No weights though,
Yeah.
just a handlebar.
Or yeah. Or very high reps.
Right.
And like, and that's still training, but it kind of like goes against the decision that you've made to go in the weight room. Like, if you're going in the weight room, then you want to train in a way that's effective to be strong.
Mhm.
Like, if you want to do endurance training, be on your bike.
Mhm.
Like, that's not to completely eschew any attempt to be specific. But what makes it specific isn't replicating them, or in my view, how you want to be specific is not in replicating the metabolic demand. It's by replicating the force expression demand. So, so what it is okay. It's easy to give guidelines, or it's easy for me to give guidelines as to what the programming variables would look like. You want to get strong, do 5 sets of 5. 4 sets of 3. Whatever it is with full recovery, because you're trying to use that environment to be strong. And then in your accessory exercises, do 3 sets of 10 or whatever. What makes it specific is in the choice of exercises and how they're executed. So if you're thinking about cycling, it's about thinking about, okay, how is force expressed in that sport? Through what joint ranges of motion? What's the rate of force development? How high are the forces? What muscles are being used? And picking exercises that do it in that way. Um, so kind of, but again, that's not to say, okay, every single exercise needs to be through the range of motion that that your lower body goes through when you're cycling, because first and foremost you want to train in a way that's going to be most effective for you gaining as much strength as you can in that regime. So kind of, if we're talking about squats, I'm sure in the cycling community there's a debate about whether deep squats are
Sure.
specific or not,
It's the next question
because
you were
you
going to
go
get asked. Yeah.
because you go into deep flexion, and certainly there's some criteria of specificity where, yeah, the fact that you're in a more flex position when you're deep squatting than you would be on the bike is less specific. However, where I would, and I get that. The flip side to that argument though is that deep squatting is, for some reason, I'm not really sure ever why, but is just this absolutely fantastic stimulus to getting stronger. So it's kind of like, well, if you've got some, if you're doing partial squatting or deep squatting, but you get stronger doing deep squatting than you do partial squatting,
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I've heard
but
some of it too is like the strain on the muscle is increased, right? As you get out of the optimal range, I think was part of it, I guess. And then there was sometimes you see an argument too where like you can do less weight, but have the more, I guess, strain be the word? I don't know if that's the right word, but on the muscle. Like, is that sort of how you think about it? That like through that full range of motion or?
I've definitely made those arguments before,
Okay. Okay.
so like, one of the things is, yes, like squatting deeper involves more of the back of the leg than the front, and that it's safer because you can get the same, you know, a similar stimulus with less weight. But at this point, I'm a bit more simple minded, or just my gut, is just there's something about that challenge to your nervous system
Mm. Hmm.
that just seems to produce big changes in your strength and in your size if that's what you're after.
Mhm.
Like in a way that, and I don't know why. Like I feel like it's a bit of a, that's a coaching intuition thing. Like why does it work? I don't know. Like I struggle to give a good argument
Yeah.
based in
Well,
literature
and then
as to why it's better,
you almost wonder if there's
but
like
it
a
is.
movement skill, athleticism piece too, that especially as cyclists, I mean, as endurance athletes, we don't. I always make the argument we're not that, we're not these NFL football players who do like backflips and dive for balls and things like that, right? It's not that athletic. So you wonder if that's also what we're looking for in the gym, is to become more athletic. And then yes, it
I
might
would do.
it might exceed the demands of the sport. I always argue that at some points we do have to tumble off our mountain bikes and put our arms over our head in explosive ways and have our joint angles that are slightly different and more irregular. But for the sport, like you wonder if the athleticism argument's like really the greatest one.
Yeah, I would take that, and also that like training has to be interesting, and you know, but I, I think that for me, if you're talking about squatting, the argument is like people would accept the idea that you need a base and then you build something on top of it. So like in cycling that you need a base that's built from long, if you're a time trialist, you need a base that's built from hours and hours on the bike, but ultimately your event is going 30 seconds flat, 30 minutes flat out. For me, the squatting argument would be more kind of like, well, where you need to be strong in cycling is through the partial range, but the base is the full range.
Mm,
That's how it
right.
feels to me.
And you could, I guess
But it's
what you,
good. It's
yeah.
interesting.
And then in a similar argument, then you would say like a lot of the year, maybe in the base phase, you would do full depth. And then perhaps towards competition phase, you would do maybe even a less taxing in that it's like a quarter squat, a half squat that's more specific range, perhaps, right? Is that sort of how you might think about
Yeah,
that?
I would see it like that because it's that's a specific preparation, and also like you make a very good point because it's neurally going to be less taxing. I think that's why squatting and deadlifting are so effective is because the full ranges of those, really hit your central nervous system really, really hard in a way that, people kind of, you'll find someone who can partial squat 200 kilos and they probably, and might only be able to full squat 120 kilos. And actually, you know, it maybe is counterintuitive, but that full squat of 120 kilos will hit your system more
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
than partial range heavier movement.
Interesting. Now you're sort of talking around, so we do still have to convince the endurance athletes a little bit, so that the fatigue because of that neuromuscular stimulation and beneficial, yes, but also perhaps fatiguing. So what do you see are some of the mistakes when we're developing our program, when we're designing our strength training program that endurance athletes do that would create more soreness, fatigue? Is there anything in the choice of reps or the timing that you think is important there?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another place where the strength and conditioning community has sometimes done a disservice to coaches and athletes because um, I in some sports strength training is a key training modality. Like
I mean,
I
track
don't think
running, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
football,
like
yeah.
at certain points of the year, like I don't think in endurance sports it will be very infrequent, apart from maybe when you're injured, where you go out and out like. And again, so sorry to go back in the black book again. I talk about like identifying which of your training sessions are the important ones,
Mhm.
and I contend that you kind of like pretty much can only have 2 or 3 bot sessions a week.
Yeah,
Like I don't think the typical endurance athlete is very frequently going to ever say, okay, yeah, my strength training session is one of those.
right. You get two. Are you going to pick? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, like like if you're a cyclist and you've got two, they're going to be sessions that are on a bike.
Hmm.
So like yeah, in designing our strength training programs, we need to keep our freshness for those sessions because that's what's important. Um, in terms of kind of like, I don't think, so personally, don't feel like soreness is something to worry about. Like when you first start strength training, you'll get sore, but but then you get used to it and it goes away. So kind of like you just when you first integrate strength training into your program, you just need to pick a sensible time to do that and accept a little bit of soreness for a few days
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
weeks. What is more of a concern is, yeah, absolutely. Like you can't be not being able to give your all in your, interval sessions because you're fatigued from the
Right.
strength training. But where lots of people don't understand strength training well, including in the strength training community, is strength training is about training your ability to express force. Like you don't have to be grinding all the time. Like you just have to be expressing force really well. So like you can have and this is like one of the absolute most important books that I think for strength training is Dan John's Easy Strength.
Sure.
And yeah, like he shows in that like you can get continuous improvement and get stronger and stronger without ever having to go to the well.
Hmm.
So kind of like for me, I would imagine in actually I don't know cycling, like in running, a lot of the week is just made up of just going and having these little jogs, which aren't that fast, but just help you feel good. Like I think so you feel like you're constantly in touch with running, and when you run, it feels good and you're bouncy and yada
Hmm.
yada yada. Like I think that for the endurance athlete, strength training sessions should be like that. Like you should go into the gym, express some force. That doesn't mean that it's light. Like it should be heavy. It's strength training, but it shouldn't be eyeballs to the wall,
Hmm.
hard. And that you go in and you feel good. You express some force in a powerful, way. Don't do too much and come out of the gym feeling better than you were when you went in.
Yeah. And so I think what you're saying, I'm going to be a little explicit here, is that you're saying Dan John stuff is sort of 2x5, 3x3, and it's done multiple times during the week, though. In your example program, I believe it was like 4x4, 4x5, something like that. Whereas what I see a lot of endurance athletes do is, the good old 3x8, 3x10, sometimes more. And so would you agree that it's in those, like the total volume and the actual reps chosen, that there's a lot of repetitions done that is partially at least causing some of the fatigue, the soreness?
It could be, or it's more the mentality of like, okay, you know, you need to be fatigued at the end of a training session.
Right. Right. You need to crawl out of the gym. Right.
Yeah, like like I don't think that that's there's times of the year for endurance athletes where I think it's probably appropriate to be a little bit fatigued when you leave the gym, but other times of the year it is you can go in, do 45 minutes, with a very modest number of reps where you just focus on doing things, like you're just tuning your body and making it feel good
Hmm. Hmm.
through the expression of high forces.
Right.
Like
And I would say most of us too. I mean, I've seen it with Dan John's stuff and programs similar to what you suggest, right? Where we're so inexperienced that even just in the neuromuscular, the initial phase of strength training, we're getting better every time, just strictly by
yeah,
doing the thing, which is motivating if we can do it and not overdo it. But then I do see a lot of cases, as you say, where it's like, okay, I knock out, PB, body weight, squats, and and then don't walk for 2 days and say I'm done with this thing. It's stupid. Or
yeah,
injure myself, right? Which would be the worst situation, is you injure yourself in
100%.
training. Yeah.
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 I mean, the only caveat I'd add on that for cycling, and again, I don't know anything about this sport, but would be that I, at the shorter distances, and I'm thinking sort of track cycling, like the level of force capacity in
Hmm.
the thighs of those people is massive, and
Well,
so kind of I'm thinking Chris Hoy and
yeah.
like
I
I
don't think
think
those people we need to sell strength training to. I think they strength train
no
more than they ride on their bikes. Yeah.
yeah But yeah, like if you're doing a cycling sport where you need that sort of capacity, then probably the weight room, like, and you're looking for that sort of hypertrophy and that sort of strength gain, in those athletes, maybe it's appropriate sometimes to be leaving the weight room hobbling a bit. Um, but
Right.
if you're a road cyclist, I'd be pretty worried if you were leaving the weight room frequently, kind of
Right.
crawling out of the weight room frequently.
Well, and I think we know how that ends, right? Whether it's a short, you never go back to the weight room after session one, or it's just like in a year you don't do it, or you're injured or something. Like we as coaches know intuitively, and we've seen that's often how it ends, right? When it's going to the well every single time, whether that's a bike workout or whatever, right? That's the idea. I think that's pretty good. I guess the other thing I wanted to, I guess around the nuts and bolts of training, I wanted to really sort of talk about that because we often don't get into that as much, and that's part of why people don't do it, I think. With the strength training session, so talk to me a bit about. So we said heavier loads. The reps are 5 reps or less. You want to be able to be pretty tired at the end of that. You almost couldn't. You talked about reps and reserves. You said maybe a couple reps more if you really had to push in that set. That's fair? That's sort of the idea of reps in reserve, like pretty hard. Maybe you could do 1, 2, 3 reps, maybe if you really had to. Is anything else on reps in reserve when you're thinking about like how hard is or how heavy?
I mean, like the reps in reserve idea, and you do have to have some skill in strength training to be able to employ that. Like,
Right,
it's an important caveat because if you've not done a lot of strength training, you don't really know.
right,
So you do have to be a reasonably experienced trainer to be able to use that concept, or have a good coach who's helping you.
right,
But the idea here is that, okay, well, like your maximal effort is the most reps you can do, and that most of the time you don't want to be training at your maximal. So however many reps you are away from your maximal kind of is a good way of defining your intensity. And so like I would suggest for an endurance athlete, because I don't think that you're going to be very frequently going to the well, like probably the most intense sessions you're going to do, you should still have 2 or 3 repetitions in reserve, depending on how many repetitions you do. So like if you're doing sets of 5, that you'd be able to do 8, but that would be absolute you tapping out. But that's the most intense session,
right.
I would suggest. So like, if you're, I like wave loading, so like if you're running a wave, so wave loading is where you kind of in a systematic way increase the intensity each week, until it gets kind of hard and then you drop down again.
Yeah.
Like, if I was doing a kind of 6-week wave then of sets of 5, I might, do something as simple as, okay, well, week 1, I've got, 8 repetitions in reserve, week 2, 7, week 3, 6, week 4,
Mm,
5, week 5,
right,
yeah,
right.
5. So that, at week 6, I'm hitting that load, which is, yeah, I've got 2 repetitions in reserve. I'm using the load that I'd use maximally for 8 reps.
Right. Right. Okay. Now, the one thing we do a lot in cycling, and I think a lot of people are doing this at home, so there is that limitation sometimes on just the total weight available. So then you get into very quickly, it looks like a circuit. The thing you said that maybe we didn't want to do as much, where it's just continuous. We're doing exercise, 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 and there's no rest in the session. We knock it out half an hour. So you're suggesting more that we use heavier loads, lighter, sorry, heavier loads, so fewer reps, but then we're going to take a recovery. So do you ever do you supersets where we go like push-ups and squats or something like that to sort of from a time maximization, or do you think it's worth going like I do a squat and then I stand around and wait for 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes? Tell me a bit about that and the recovery between the exercises.
It's a really nice question. Like, I think people, so like the classic kind of guideline that you'll be given if it's pure, maximum strength training is that you should have full recovery, and that's 3 to 5 minutes. But the important thing here isn't the minutes; it's the full recovery. if you're a powerlifter who is capable of giving an absolutely unbelievable explosion of neural energy into a
Right.
250 kilo squat,
Yeah.
then it might take you 5, 10, or 15 minutes to recover from that.
Right.
If you're a 55 kilo distance runner who's still doing something that's relatively difficult for them, but like a 55 kilo runner who's distance runner who, squatting a set of 5 for 50 kilos with, 5 repetitions in reserve,
Hmm.
it's still, a challenge. But it's not going to take you 5 minutes to recover,
Right.
from it. And if you superset some press ups with that, it's, the fatigue from doing that set of squats isn't systemic, it's probably in your legs. So kind of
Right.
like, doing some press ups isn't going to hamper your recovery.
Right.
Whereas the power lifter, well, the first 5 minutes they're panting, to
Yes.
get their breath back, and then the next 10 minutes, it would hamper their recovery because they've had a massive systemic challenge.
Right.
So to answer the question, I think, it depends on the person, but the guideline here is it should be genuine strength training. So like you shouldn't be having your effort compromised because you're panting or because your muscles still feel tired. Um, However, because you're not going to the well, because your level of ability to give big neural efforts is small,
Hmm.
means that probably, yeah, you can do
Okay.
your set of squats, take 30 seconds, get your breath back, go and do a set of press ups. Yeah,
Right.
I would superset for time
Yeah.
in this
Yeah. It's
population.
just because sometimes you'll see the program and you're like, well, but if I waited 5 minutes, even if you're, doing some mobility or you're doing something in there to like make your time somewhat, usable, it's like this is going to take 100 minutes for me to do my 50 kilogram
Oh,
squats here. This seems excessive. But that's a great answer. I do. I guess there's the caveat because I always wonder. It's like a chicken and the egg, where it's like, okay, I'm doing 50 kilogram squats, but is it because I keep doing the supersets and the shorter recovery because I'm an endurance athlete and I'm so fit? It's like chicken and the egg. Or if I took the recoveries, would I be able to do 100 kilogram squats eventually? Right? Like, are you hampering? And that's like the trickies. You want to be careful, I think.
I mean, and I get it. Like we all worry about the effectiveness of our training programs. It's one of the main things that hurts
Keeps you
our,
up at night. Yeah.
improvement. But like it really is. I think a good rule of thumb that I've just made up off the top of my head,
Sure.
on that is like, of maximum strength training is largely like, are you ready to go again? Do you have the appetite to go again?
Hmm.
Like there's a squat program called the smaller squat program, and
Smaller.
which smaller, SMOLOV, and
Okay.
it's stupid. It's stupid.
Okay.
Like
Okay.
like you can't do it. It's not realistic to think that you'd complete it if you're not on drugs.
Okay.
Um, but most or many strength coaches try and do it as a rite of passage because we're stupid, and I'm equally stupid and has tried it. But like, for instance, like one of the sessions is 4 sets of 9 squat. But but like I when I did that, like and you're getting later in the program and the intensity is very high, it really is that, you lie on the floor for 15 minutes and still really, really don't want to do the next set.
Right.
Like, or that's where kind of, this, okay, well, you need 5 or more minutes comes from. But for the endurance athlete, like, yeah, if you're ready to go, like like you do see people who are, playing on their phone as they wait out the 5 minutes, when they're clearly recovered, or which also is going to hamper your, performance, but like, or improvement. But yeah, like it's, if you're ready,
Right.
You
And
know,
I
like
think maybe the other, this top of the head thing, there should be, you talked about wave loading and like a program, there should almost be, this is the weight I'm doing today. This is what I was expecting was 4 sets of 5 with 50 kilograms. Good. Did you do it? Yes, no. Okay. Well, next week there should be some sort of progression. And then did you do that? Yes, no. And if you're doing them back to back to back to back with no recovery or whatever, or in a circuit, and you're not, oh, I stopped, I can't do it. Well, then we ask about recovery,
I think
perhaps.
I think that's a really good example as well, because if you're taking the wave loading, I think that the week one, like I think if you've got the load right, it really should be almost that if when you got to the end of your set, someone said, okay, just go again, that you could,
Mhm. Which
because
would
it's
help
easy.
with soreness too, right? Like I sometimes like that when someone's starting because hopefully that means they're not crippled the next day, right?
No, absolutely. So like, yeah, like week one, it really should be like, you know what, I really only just need to put the bar down, like take a minute and I can go. Whereas, week six, yeah, I need that rest. I need that rest. Like, that means that you're getting those, you know, getting those variables correct, I think.
Love it.
I think what the problem with the way most people's training goes is it's not differentiated in that way, and they just have the same rest periods and the same have the same experience, every week.
Every
So
week.
like when
Yeah.
whereas it shouldn't be like it should be like, day one it's like I go like it's nothing. I go to the gym, I chat to my friends, I do something.
Right.
Like what like whereas week six it's like I'm going to the weight room. I know I have to have my game on. I have my music, whatever it is, and I'm
Right.
focused. And now I'm talking about that for strength athletes because I don't think week six for an endurance athlete would require that sort of intensity either. You know, but the point of having a differentiated profile of how your training looks as you go through the weeks is the same.
Yeah, and for a lot of the athletes that I work with, it's getting past that 5 pound dumbbell, right? And it's sometimes I'm like, you need to buy a new dumbbell. This is the progression for you. You will get faster just by buying the new dumbbell or whatever the apparatus or the equipment is. But it's like if you're still doing the 5 pound dumbbell for 10 reps 2 years later, right? Like, this is not what we're looking for.
But I think that as well, like, probably, and again, I don't mean to alienate your listeners, but like, cyclists are very prepared to spend lots of money on their bike, but maybe not on the equipment, or the resistance training equipment. This is where, if we go back to the the discussion we were having about whether you squat deep or not, like, I always feel like, okay, well, if the weight run becomes another sport for you, then it's a much more attractive proposition. So and kind of like, okay, well, if you're going and doing partial range squats, like you're just training for cycling, aren't you? But if
Right.
if you're training weightlifting, say, and you start getting interested in that as a new sport, and it not detracting from your cycling,
Mhm.
but those choices then make it easier to do that activity, and equally, you'd probably be a bit more willing to fork out, on
Yeah.
the next
Invest in it.
thing
Yeah.
that you need.
Well, and I love that, with our consummate athlete branding, I guess, or philosophy, that is like the cross training enters you into another community. And you've hit right on that, where the gym should be a whole other sport. So when you are injured from cycling, or it's snowing or raining, or you don't want to bike anymore, this whole other world is open and new friends and everything else. Like, I think that's a fantastic message that we should probably close on. But I think you've hit and come full circle to like the why of this whole strength training isn't, the performance we talked a lot about today, and getting faster is important, and health. But I love that you finished with this idea of like, it's another sport, it's another community, another pursuit, another way to improve. I think it's just fantastic message. Is there anything else, Dan? We'll link to your books. Well, obviously.
Thank you.
Is there anything else you wanted to leave us with today as far as strength training for endurance performance?
Um, Only as much, like to kind of reinforce your message of like, well, you know, you know, or strength training, whether it's for performance or health, most of the time, like, yeah, you should be leaving the gym feeling better than when you walked in.
Mm-hmm.
Like that. I think that's probably true for cycling as well. But like, Yeah, sometimes you can leave feeling a bit more tired, but generally, like you're gonna have more consistent progression if yeah, like and be more willing to train. If you know that, yeah, after I've gone to the gym and done my 45 minutes, I'm gonna feel great.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like an obvious paradigm, but not a common one. So I love it.
I don't know.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Dan. We'll end there.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete podcast. If you want to hear more training, racing, and endurance sport advice, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at consummateathlete.com for a weekly dose of inspiration and advice straight to your inbox.